Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sabrina Kofer, and on behalf of Choice and ACRL, I'd like to welcome you to today's program, A Librarian's Guide to Cybercrime Mitigation, which is sponsored by Scholarly Network Security Initiative, or SNSI. This 90-minute session is one in a series of sponsored webinars from Choice and ACRL that addresses new ideas and developments of interest to the academic library community. Before we get started, I'd like to point out a few features of the webinar software. All of the attendees who join the presentation are automatically muted and your cameras are off, so don't worry about generating any noise or feedback. We've got that taken care of for you. In the main area of the screen, you can follow along with the presentation materials. We are using the Q&A feature today. Please use it to ask questions of our speakers. We'll answer as many questions as we have time for at the end of the presentation, so please do type your questions into the Q&A module as they occur to you. You can also use the upvote feature to highlight questions that you like. Also note that there will be an interactive session later in the presentation, and we will open the chat then for you to submit any comments. Also note that there is closed captioning available for today's session. To toggle the automated captions on or off, please use the CC button on the bottom right corner of your screen. Last, please note that we are recording today's program, and everyone who registered should receive a follow-up email with a link to the archive version. And with that, we are ready to get started, so I will hand it over to Gwen.
Welcome, and thank you for joining our webinar today. I'm Gwen Evans, and I'm pleased to be your moderator for an excellent panel on cybercrime mitigation for libraries. This is a 90-minute webinar, and I have three distinguished panelists who will give brief presentations, and then we'll wrap up with an interactive session designed to test some of your own cybersecurity practices. We will then answer your questions, and we hope you have many of them. I'm also a member of the Scholarly Network Security Initiative, or SNSI, which is sponsoring this webinar. We bring publishers and institutions together to address cyber challenges threatening the integrity of the scholarly and scientific record, scholarly systems, and the safety of personal data. Since our founding in 2019, our diverse membership has grown to include libraries, large and small publishers, learned societies, university presses, and others devoted to upholding the integrity of the scholarly record. Cybercrime is not limited to publishing. It affects all areas of digital life. Cybercrime negatively impacts our work as librarians, as academics, publishers, and primary research providers. Today, we'll be focusing on cybercrime mitigation awareness, challenges, and some practical tips for the library environment. My panelists today are Ben Woelk, who is Governance, Awareness, and Training Manager in the Information Security Office at the Rochester Institute of Technology, Theda Schwing, who is the Associate Director of Discovery and Delivery at OhioLINK, and Carlota Sage, vCISO and instructor at gracie.org. Ben, I'm handing it over to you.
Great, thank you, Gwen. And I will call attention to the opening poll question. If you all would like to provide that information, it would be really great to get a sense of the audience here. I'm going to talk about campus and culture today, and it may seem a little, it's not exactly the what do you think of when you're thinking about cybersecurity, but a lot of my work has had to do with how do you embed good habits in your population. A little bit about RIT. Again, we're in Rochester, New York. I think it's a medium to large size for a private university. We have a large on-campus presence, and we have really increasing doctoral activity over the last couple of years. The other thing that's of note is that we are also the home for the National Technical Institute for the Deaf. So we have to be very careful in terms of making sure we're providing accessible programming. So preparing for this conversation today, I'm really looking forward to see what questions come in. I chatted with our research library staff to get a sense from them of where they felt like some of the concerns and issues were. And I'm also bringing in some content. I'm full-time staff in the Information Security Office, but I'm also an adjunct professor, and I teach cybersecurity policy and law. And last year, Sari came up, did a guest lecture for us from SNSI. And we talked about the publishing ecosystem and really the concerns about what's going on, why we're concerned about this at all. But the questions I really had in talking to our audience here, and I'm asking partially because I know some of this, but I definitely have not known all of it. And I'm in charge of security awareness at our university. But does your population, does your community understand the value of the resources that you all provide? Do they understand what the risks are to those resources? And we're primarily talking about availability because that's what they're primarily going to be noticing if they can't get to something. Do they understand why access needs to be controlled? RIT, they go in through a VPN, so they have to at least represent that they're on campus to reach a lot of the collections. Does your population understand why that's even important? Do they understand who bears the cost of disruptions? And frankly, in talking to my students, they don't really understand why they should care. And it's an interesting issue because they see a little bit, they know there's money exchanging hands, they know the libraries pay for access to some of these collections, but they don't really get a good understanding of why that should really matter to them, because a lot of them aren't doing research at that stage either. Another question that came up in talking to our library staff is, is some of your communities sharing their passwords with family members or other people so they can access collections that they wouldn't normally have access to? And another piece that came up had to do with the researchers understanding how it works and does the way that they're able to access resources match the way they'd want to do research. We have some researchers who honestly would like to go online and download everything they possibly can about their topic at one time and go back to it and look at it later. We have other ones who may be more hit or miss in terms of how often they're accessing the collections. But I know that there have been conversations about, are there thresholds in terms of the number of articles they can download at one time? Are there speed limitations? And these are things that aren't typically necessarily known, maybe even to the library staff, but it impacts user experience with these collections. So looking at these things, these are questions I had in my mind about some of this. And my real question is, how are you all communicating this with your community? Maybe they don't need to know all of it, but some of these sections would be really helpful in terms of helping your patrons understand how to best use the resources. And for me, I mentioned that I've really been looking at culture change the last few years in terms of security awareness. I want to make things easy for people. I don't want people to have to make a decision or a security decision every time they encounter anything. So the real question then is, how do we make these good practices habitual? How do we change the culture? And contextualization is a big piece of this, explaining why this matters to them. I know in terms of the normal security awareness type training, we're always pulling in examples of how this might impact them outside of RIT, so that it kind of brings them home to them. But just even having an understanding of what do these resources mean? Why does it matter? Why aren't they free? Why does it matter if people's access is limited? Those kind of questions are, I think, important to communicate. And the other things I have on my slide are, you repeat it, because as we all know, at least in a university setting, we have 25 to 30% turnover every year in terms of our patrons. So it's new every year, whether we're feeling like we're saying the same thing over and over and over and over again. Again, also potentially providing a reward and recognition. I haven't really thought through how that would apply to these issues or these topics, but I think it's another good way to think about how do you get engagement with your community. So key considerations in effecting change. I try to look at things in terms of how do you approach things strategically? What are the elements you have in place? And what I would encourage you all to do is you think through the best way to communicate security, access to library resources, these types of things to your communities, are define some goals in terms of what you want to communicate. Really, really key is figure out who your different audiences are. We all know we have a faculty, staff, and students at a university, but it's really a lot more fine-grained than that. And we have researchers who need to access different types of collections. Maybe they're parts of different colleges within the same university. But really understanding who these audiences are so that you can contextualize information so it makes sense to them. Figuring out what some of your actual messaging might be, how you're going to communicate, what are the different channels you have available. It could be signage. Are there partners that you can leverage on campus? I know RIT, the position isn't currently filled, but they had a marketing specialist as part of their library staff. And I'm not sure how typical that is. And also determining some type of measurement so that you can determine whether your efforts are successful in changing behavior and communicating. And I'll wrap up with just thinking about who the partnership opportunities are. Maybe it's your marketing communications group that can come in and provide all that polish that we might not necessarily have the skills to do ourselves, and certainly to make sure you're meeting the branding guidelines. Maybe your IT communications, your information security office. I'm responsible for crafting annual cybersecurity training for faculty, staff, and students. I don't currently have any information in there about library usage. That is likely going to change after participating in this panel, but find out who your partners are. Maybe there are different things you can leverage to provide the information. And finally, consider bringing in third-party presenters who are experts in different fields. This is, for us, it's university. They're used to experts coming in. And unfortunately, the experts, just because they're from somewhere else, tend to carry a lot more weight with the audiences than if we're trying to say the things ourselves. But again, I thank you for your time, and I'm looking forward to hearing the other presentations and for our discussion later. So Theda, I think it goes to you.
We do have another poll. So while Theda starts, please answer the poll question.
All right, so looks like I've got control of the slides. The piece of this that I would like to talk a little bit about is response to incidents that might happen and being prepared for that response plan. To start off, I want to talk a little bit about OhioLINK. So OhioLINK is the academic library consortium in Ohio, as our name suggests. We've got about 117 member libraries covering a wide range of different types of institutions. And our three main services are shared print collections, shared e-resources, and technology services. We're also a part of another consortium in the state, the Ohio Technology Consortium, or OTEC. And with OTEC, we work with the shared infrastructure support there to run all of the technology that supports those services that we provide to our members. So from there, let's talk a little bit about workflows. And you might first ask the question, why talk about this at all in a presentation that's focused on cybersecurity or cybercrime? And the thing that I'd like to pitch to you is that by looking at workflows, or at least some of your library's workflows, you can better prepare for any kind of cybersecurity or security event that might happen at your library. And this is not dissimilar from disaster planning or business continuity planning. And kind of will let you focus a little bit on maybe some of the non-technical parts of this response that will be very helpful to have worked out in advance. At its best, having a workflow in place is going to help you document a complex series of steps that could involve many different partners on your campus and will help you as an organization determine how you're going to respond to a particular event. You're not going to leave things up to memory. You're not going to leave it to which staff are in the building on a particular day or on a particular time. And maybe the most important part is you're going to give yourself a little bit of time to think through what the correct response to a situation is, rather than have quick responses be dictated by a time pressure, as if you were reacting to something in real time. So hopefully that is enough of a pitch to you to keep you with me here for the next couple of slides and to look at some workflows you might consider. So a good place to start would be to list and to think about all of the different technology services that your library is using or maintaining. Some of these are going to be very clear right off the bat. So you probably have an ILS, you might be running a proxy server. Some of them might be a little further out. So your library's website or a LibGuide site or something like that where you're directing patrons. Could also include an institutional repository if you're maintaining an institutional repository, and it could include user accounts that library staff use. For example, you might have institutional accounts and passwords that you're using to access usage stats on a vendor site, and those might be accounts that are used across your institution and aren't specific to an individual at your library. For those services, start to think about who's responsible for each of them. This could be the IT department on your campus. This could be a vendor if you're working with a hosted service. This could be the library itself. This could be an IT department within your library. The setups are many. It's probably specific, very specific to your institution, but know who's responsible. And having said that, that's also a trick question, because there are lots of different parts of management that you can start to tease apart. In terms of usage monitoring, who's making sure that usage on a particular service is, within the normal ranges, there's not suspicious activity being documented. Also, user accounts. If you're running a service like an ILS, you might have staff accounts that are being created and password management processes that are in place. You could have regular software updates for new features for the services you're running and to fix bugs, and then those in the moment security patches that need to happen in response to a particular vulnerability that's been uncovered. You could have a regular backup process, and then in addition to that, there could be some additional digital preservation that you're doing, particularly for very, very important and unique content that your library is responsible for. As an example, you might have a system where the usage monitoring, the security patches, and the backups are being handled by your local IT. You might collaborate with your IT on running those software updates, and the library might be responsible for the account management for staff users and digital preservation. All of those things should be working pretty closely together, and you should have an idea of who's doing this while it's working correctly and nothing has happened yet. Because when something happens, you now know who to talk to for each of these individual pieces. So let's talk about what happens when there is a problem. A question you should ask yourself is, if something happens, how will I know? Am I going to have a vendor alert me to the problem? Am I going to have a patron contact the library? Will my IT department contact me? Am I the one responsible for monitoring a particular service, so I should be looking for the problem? And those reports will come in a variety of ways. You might get a phone call, you might get a direct email to a staff member, you might see something posted on social media, you might have a ticketing system that you're running or a chat window on your library's website. So be aware of how these problems are going to be reported, and then be ready with your next step. You could imagine a variety of situations. I'll list 3 of them. You might have a patron report a browser security problem when they visit a library website. You might have your IT report to you a problem that your institutional repository that they are hosting all of a sudden is unavailable. You might have a vendor report to you that they've noticed suspicious activity on an IP that's related to your institution. All of these things, it is good to have your next step ready so that you can immediately receive that vendor report, let them know you're investigating, and then immediately contact whoever that next person is. If it's in your library, if it's your IT, whatever that process is. And then as a last piece, and I think sometimes overlooked, have a good idea when you walk through the troubleshooting steps, know when the problem is going to be resolved. So sometimes problems, particularly when there are lots of people involved, can drag out. You should have a good idea of when you will know we've addressed this problem, we can consider it closed and move on to the next thing. And once you've walked through these steps, congratulations, you have now a brief step that you can start to work through with your various partners. And this sets you on the path to a lot of incremental improvement. Once you have a plan, it's a lot easier to review that documentation and start to find small things that you didn't consider before that can make your response just a little bit better. For example, you can eliminate single points of failure. If a vendor is set to contact you for those suspicious activity alerts, and that's going to a single staff member's email, when that person goes on vacation for 2 weeks, you will already be behind in your response time to handle that problem. So maybe you can set up a distribution list so that that email comes from the vendor and goes to multiple people on your staff. Maybe it goes into a ticketing system so that many people can review it at once. You're not dependent on a particular person to take that next step. You can also notice places where your partnerships could use a little bit of strengthening. For example, if in response to a problem, your plan is to contact your local IT department, but you haven't listed which person you're going to contact or what their email is or their position, or that you'll use the ticketing system to contact IT, that's a place you could improve that plan so that when you get to that step, you don't have to think about it. It's in the plan, you know what to do. And then, so wash, rinse, repeat, right? You're going to review these plans hopefully fairly often, perhaps as staff at your institution leave or join, as staff at your IT department leave or join, to make sure that all of your contacts are up to date and you are always ready with this plan. Hopefully, you never have to put it into practice. But if you do, that's also a great opportunity to find places where on paper, the plan seemed solid. In practice, you maybe could have put out a little bit different communication or contacted someone sooner or later. So you can always be improving the plans that you have existing. And last, oops, sorry, I skipped ahead one too far. Other considerations. Thinking about these steps, I've really thought about library-specific services, but there is a lot of other services and utilities that you rely on at the library that are not library specific on your campus. And you can immediately think of, for example, your institution's IT might have some network support that they're doing for the entire campus. Your email is probably at the entire campus level. Websites might also be controlled at that campus level. And when there are problems with these services, it's going to affect the library too. So be aware of how your IT department or that broader campus community is going to let the library know or let that community know when there are problems with these other services that definitely impact you. Is it a status website to let you know which services are up and which ones are down? Is it a social media account that will send alerts to you? Is it a direct email that will send alerts to you? Make sure you're watching whatever that channel looks like so that when there's a campus problem, you're aware of it as soon as possible. Also, as you're going through your workflows about how you'll respond to different events, do consider what happens when key pieces of your response plan aren't available. For example, if campus email were down and you needed to contact a vendor, do you know how to do that? Do you have that email listed somewhere else in a different document so that you have a way to get in contact with a vendor or another library staff member or your IT in a different way? And this applies to a couple of different services that might be campus-wide. Again, hopefully it never happens, but if it does, it can really throw you for a loop. And if you've thought about it ahead of time, it'll throw you less. With that, I'll close and pass things over to you, Carlota.
Thank you so much, Theda. I am Carlota Sage. I am a virtual CISO. And what that means is that, well, first of all, what a CISO is, a Chief Information Security Officer. If you don't have one at your library or organization, when an organization is large enough to need security, they need somebody to drive that strategy, and that's their CISO. But the reality is that, especially over the last 5-10 years, smaller and smaller organizations really need security strategy earlier and earlier. And so when they can't afford to hire a full-time CISO, they're not ready to have that full-time person, they'll come to an organization like my prior organization, Fractional CISO, or to an organization like Gracie, the nonprofit with whom I'm an instructor and a vCISO, and they'll hire us for a fraction of the time, and we'll get their security program started. We'll coach folks through their security programs so that even if there are two people, they still have a good sense of security. So I tend to focus on very small organizations, sub 300 person organizations. I'm one of those consultants that Ben talked about earlier. People will bring me in even in a larger organization because it is often easier for leadership to hear a consultant than to hear inside. And to be clear, the first thing I do is talk to everyone and find out what the problems are and present them in a way that's meaningful to leadership. So from that perspective, what I wanted to talk about today is you. Let's see if I can move this. There we go. Cybersecurity is not just technology. We tend to think of it that way, especially for those of us who really love technology. We want to solve everything with technology. Technology makes our lives easier. It's fun for us to play with. But the reality is that cybersecurity at its heart is that data or lives that you're protecting if you're not in a library, if you're in a hospital. But there are three pillars there: people, processes, and technology. So I want to take technology out of the discussion today because tools aren't enough. And each individual who's listening to this, you are critical to the cybersecurity process. Cybersecurity is a relay race. IT sets up the general tools, your productivity tools and your security tools, but then they hand you a baton as a user and hopefully train you to use those tools in a safe way. And then you use those tools, you build processes around them, right? And then you pass that baton back to IT or security to protect you. So a lot of people will say users are your weakest link, and I really disagree with that. If you train your users well, they are your first line of defense. Everything that you do as an individual impacts not just you, but the organization and the organization's mission. So when I come into an organization, I try to look at it from this picture, right? When I talk to leadership, when I talk to people, I don't want to talk about technology alone. I want to talk about the organizing principle around how are you talking? How are you approaching security? Who is doing security in your organization? And in every organization I've ever talked to, even if they aren't doing security at all at an organizational level, somebody in that organization is trying to do the right thing to protect the data and the people that that organization serves. They're trying to serve the mission in a secure and informed way. Once you can kind of coalesce a team or an initiative around that, you're moving more towards that middle column, that team or compliance driven. It's very easy to get security. Security is not compliance, but it's easier to drive some security initiatives for organizations that are beholden to regulations and to compliance. I know for educational institutions, you've got FSMA, you've got FERPA. There are some basic compliance needs there that you can kind of hang your security initiatives onto. And then once your organization has really embraced it, security is an organization-wide risk management tool, because at its heart, what you're trying to do is reduce the risk to the organization. You want to make sure that you're protecting everyone and everything as much as possible, but it's really about taking risks. The only way to completely protect everyone is to completely disconnect from the internet, and that's just not a realistic objective for most of us. Organizational awareness, that plays a huge part in cybersecurity. If there's no common understanding of cybersecurity or information security or compliance across your organization, you're not doing very well, right? Once you've got that kind of team-driven approach where people are saying, okay, we're documenting things, we're making things more consistent from team to team, then you have that shared definition of security. Once you have that shared framework, it's a lot easier for the whole organization to move forward. And then once you've gone really far into that, you've really baked it into everything you do. Security becomes a discussion at the beginning of every program, initiative, product, anything that you're rolling out. There's going to be at least a few minutes about security and compliance. And then speaking back to what Theda and Ben were talking about, culture. I can't underscore enough how important culture is in securing your environment. If you see security has a technology problem, it's IT's problem, then that you fundamentally are not serving your mission. You've got to see it as enabling the entire organization. You can't see it as a compliance issue. You can't see it as a technology issue. It has to be core, especially when it comes to privacy, especially in the United States. You as librarians are voices of truth, your sources of truth for your communities, your community hubs. It's really important that your organization as a whole understands what you're protecting and why, right? Technology, again, I'm not going to emphasize this too much, but there's that kind of, oh, we're going to throw a bunch of tools at this, that's going to solve the problem. It doesn't. Security tools are then sometimes brought in from the outside. There's some pressure out there. Oh, you've had a ransomware attack. Now you suddenly have budget for security tools. But in a risk management perspective, your security tooling is going to be in place to help the business or the organization, again, serve the mission. For my clients who are for-profit clients, security is a differentiator for them. It's a sales enablement piece. I had one particular client who served higher education, and they could not serve those higher education, the larger institutes and universities, without having a solid security program. So that from the larger institutes is working very well. The vendors are hearing that message. But when it comes down to it, it's about ownership and leadership. Everyone's responsible, but no one's accountable, then you don't really have a great cybersecurity program. You've got to have some central owner that can drive that initiative and be ultimately accountable for its success or failure. Now, what I want you to do as a librarian is to think about this and figure out where you think your organization is. Maybe you take this slide to your IT or security department and have a conversation with them and find out how you as an individual can help champion and ally with that security team or IT team to make this a meaningful conversation with the entire space that you're in. Well, we'll talk about in the interactive sessions or some things, some tools that you as a person can leverage to protect yourself both at home and at work. And then past that, I think we're just going to go and have some great interactive discussion with our panel. I'm going to pass it back to you, Gwen.
And right now we have another poll about, as we start the interactive session, about your experience with browser plugins. So the interactive session is going to concentrate on some tools and practices that you can evaluate for yourself, or in the library context, the tools that you send out to your users or you use within the library. And here's the, oh, many of you have installed one for personal use. And I do know libraries have created some great browser plugins, but only 7% of you or your library has done that. Okay, Carlota, here we go with the interactive session.
Okay. All right, chat is open, by the way. We're going to have a poll here. I want to know, actually, I think we've missed a poll. We should be starting with passwords. Yeah, so first poll is, how do you come up with your passwords? Do you have them memorized and you just rotate through a couple of them? Do you have an algorithm in your head for creating some passwords? Do you use your browser to create them and save them? Or are you actually running a password manager? I'll give you folks a few seconds to answer this. Oh, sorry, I am lagging a little bit here. All right. And the reason I asked this question is because one of the first lines of defense, of course, is your password, right? And what we see is that if your password's very good, oh, here we go. If your password's very good, too, yes. you are literally the first line of defense right there. What happens is attackers who are very well organized these days, I'll tell you this, attackers have call centers the way that Netgear or Netflix has a call center, right? They are extremely well organized, and their goal is to get your password. So a lot of these breaches, what they're doing is they're looking for your password, they're taking your email ID and the password that they've gotten in a breach, and then they're going to other places and seeing if they can use that ID and password. This is why we really, really discourage using the same password over and over again. So if you have that one or maybe a small handful of passwords that you're rotating through, you are immediately at a much higher risk than not just for yourself, but for your organization, right? So if somebody manages to get your ID and password from a retail site, for example, and you just happen to use that password for a work service of some sort, they can map back. They absolutely know that, you know, Joe Smith here at gmail.com is also Joe Smith at library.edu, right? They have that data mapping in the background, and they will use that and try to break into your work account. If you have an algorithm in your head, that's potentially good. I've seen that be very good for some folks. If I see that not many people use the browser to create and save passwords, I'm actually okay with that, because what's happening is as we get better and better at passwords, attackers are attacking our browsers directly and trying to pull the passwords that we save out of there. And if you have a password manager, that is the best way to actually create and save a password. So what we've got up here is a QR code. And that's another security question, right? Can I trust this QR code? We're in a high trust environment, so I promise you, this QR code goes to a bit.ly link, which resolves to security.org's how secure is my password. So if you have a password that you use in a lot of places, or just take your home email account password, plug it into their how secure is my password. So I'm going to give folks a minute to pop in there, plug in a password in there, and then I want you in chat to tell me how long it takes a computer to crack your password. So if your password is password, for example, a computer can crack that instantaneously. If it's password with an @ symbol where the A is and a 0 for the O, it takes a matter of hours. So, oh, wow, I'm seeing some really great answers. 2 million years. Karen, I'm hoping that means that you're using a password manager and you're generating really long passwords, really good, beefy passwords. So, oh, 3 days. Yeah, you're owned, unfortunately. I'm loving these really high ones. If you've got under a couple thousand years, you're at risk, to be honest, because quantum computing is coming around the corner, and even a few thousand years is going to suddenly become a matter of hours. If you're in the couple 100 years or less, then yeah, that's very quickly. If you're anything under, I'd say 30 days, that's high risk right there. So I love how many millions of years and trillions of years that I'm, oh, sextillion years. Wow. Yeah. So you folks who are saying septillion, trillion, et cetera, kinds of years, let me know if you're using something other than a password manager. The great thing about a password manager is that you can share it across multiple devices. I know that there is a concern that, oh, what if my password manager gets hacked? What if the company that does that gets hacked? It's possible. It's always possible. Anything is possible. It's highly unlikely. And if it's a reputable vendor, they've done an encryption in such a way that even if they do get attacked, somebody would have to also have attacked you directly to get the key to unencrypt all of your passwords. Again, highly unlikely, not impossible. If you're a high value target, it's certainly, if you're, the president of the United States, somebody might be very motivated, especially a Chinese government or Russian government backed attacker might be motivated to do that. So, yes, I see some really great, oh, good. I see some really great things. Encoded sentence I use for most of my important passwords, 700 years. All right. So, but again, with this QR code, you're in a trusted situation to click on that. I would not recommend clicking on QR codes in general if you don't know where they're coming from. If you're at your favorite restaurant and the QR code is taped to the table, that's 50-50 to me, because somebody could come in there and some joker could come in, pull the tape off, put a new QR code. If it's on a board or something on a wall where somebody can't easily rip it and replace it, then I'm going to use that QR code to pull up the menu. That's the kind of thing that you want to look at. Oh, now you're telling me all your secrets. Don't tell me your secrets. All right. Does anyone have a question around why, it's important to have really strong passwords? Okay.
I saw a question go by in the chat
Sure.
that we might be able to.
Sure.
Someone had asked how to choose a password manager, and
Okay.
my default answer would be, it's likely that if you are working with an IT department, they might have some recommendations or
Right.
suggestions for you,
Right.
particularly if you want to use it for work-related
Right.
passwords and to manage those. But I wasn't sure if you had a different answer.
No, that's I think that's a really good answer, is to start if you're talking about managing passwords for work. If your IT department has one that they'll support, absolutely would use that. PC Magazine will every year or two rank password managers. You can certainly Google for that and find their article. I think they did one in 2021. 1Password, LastPass, Keeper, all of the big names are pretty reliable. I use 1Password myself because I like the interface. If you wanted to download a couple of them, play with them, see which interface you like, anything in the top 10 on PC Magazine is going to be a reasonable password manager. And you'll see security people go, oh, don't write your passwords down. Okay. Let's be realistic. Don't write your passwords down in an office environment where lots of people can walk by your desk and see your password list, right? But in a home office where you're really the only person in there, you can still write them down. I would still put them in a locked drawer, but it's also critical as an individual that if you have a password manager, definitely write down the password to that, stick in a lockbox. And if something happens to you, that way your family has access to your passwords and to your accounts, right? So, exercise caution, make sure you're situationally aware. I would not write down passwords if you're in an office, if you're in a shared office, right? If you are in a home office, I'm willing to say, write it down, put it in a safe spot, and make sure that your family knows where it is if something happens to you, because that can also help you out at work. Okay. I think we've done pretty well with the password checker. You folks have done a great job with those. Let's go to another poll and let's find out, what do you do when you get a breach notification? Do you actually bother doing anything? Do you ignore it? Do you go to that service, delete your account, and never use that platform again? Yeah, some banks are phasing out safe deposit boxes. So I'm going to pause here. Somebody is asking a question. How insecure is a browser that I log into with two-step authentication in regards to keeping and suggesting passwords? Okay, I'm going to pause on reading out the poll here and address that, because that's a very good question. One of the reasons that we have two-factor authentication is because your password really is very vulnerable. If a service gets breached and they are able to get your ID and your password, that means they can log into that service if that service doesn't realize they've been breached, right? One of the reasons you turn on that two-factor or multi-factor authentication is to prevent that. So, breaches can go undetected for years sometimes. You definitely, on every service that's available, you want to turn on that two-factor authentication. The reason I say don't save it in the browser is because as we're getting better at those good long passwords and turning on 2FA, attackers are getting savvier and savvier about attacking the browser directly. And currently browsers, I don't believe, encrypt very well your password in there. It's actually in plain text. So if somebody's able to breach your browser, or if you're in a vulnerable situation and somebody can get physical access to your laptop, they can get hold of your passwords in your browser. So that's why I say don't use them there.
Yeah, Carlota, I want to
Sure.
mention something. I mean, you mentioned two-factor authentication and multi-factor authentication, which is absolutely critical to do it wherever you can. But I also want to be sure that you don't think that's going to make everything perfectly safe.
Correct.
The kinds of attacks I know that universities are seeing and Uber and other people are seeing, they're more social engineering areas, and they are also relying on what we're just calling duo fatigue. You know, if you're using Duo as your multi-factor authenticator. And what's happening is that people are getting their passwords and their login credentials compromised. And the attacker will just keep trying. And sometimes the person whose credentials are compromised eventually just hits yes when they've received that multi-factor authentication request multiple times. So that's something new. We're kind of thinking through how to best approach that communications wise. But multi-factor is absolutely critical, but it's not going to be perfect.
It is not the silver bullet. There is no silver bullet, correct? I would like to also suggest that if you are being spammed with a multi-factor attack where they're just constantly pushing a notification to your phone, hoping that you deliberately or accidentally, which is just as bad, click yes, right? If that's happening, turn off your phone, find another way of contacting your IT team and letting them know that's going on. And then if you can, go ahead and log in, change your password immediately so that if something happens and you do accidentally or did accidentally click yes, as soon as you can, see if you can regain control of that account. All right, so our interactive session poll number 2. Most of you don't ignore it. I appreciate that. Most of you don't delete your account. You do go and change your password in that service. That's good. I also generally suggest, if you're using the same password, not necessarily, true, but if you are using the same password for your home email or the email that you've got attached to a service and for the service itself, also make sure you're changing your personal or that email password to make sure that they don't try to reuse that password on you.
Yeah. And I think the big thing is just don't do that.
Yeah, don't do that. Really don't do that. Never reuse a password. It's really not a good idea. Google and Apple both now will check passwords that you've saved in your phone or your browser, and they'll check them against known databases of breached passwords, which you can also do for yourself in some cases. If you go to Have I Been Pwned? A lot of you may already know this. If you don't, I highly recommend going to this website and putting in your work email, your home email, and just see what services attached to those email addresses have been breached in the last several years. And Have I Been Pwned will go back several years, especially since sometimes you don't discover a breach for 2 to 3 years. You may see that you've got accounts on services that you haven't used in 5 or 6 years that have been breached. So cannot stress enough the importance of not reusing your password. Is there anyone who has been to this? And I'm going to give you folks a minute or two to pop over to Have I Been Pwned and put in an email address or two. Has anyone ever used this before? If you've used it before in the chat, tell me what you did when you realized, yeah, great. Yeah. So I think it is a very helpful site. I like going there a couple of times a year and just checking, right? Yes, Emily went through and deleted a bunch of old accounts. And that's when Amy started using a password manager. Very good. And just going back to passwords, longer is better, right? But some services will have a cap. They'll have a minimum. Usually the minimum is 8. I suggest at least 16, just from an algorithm perspective, the longer the password, the better. 16 is the minimum, I would say. That gives you, I think, several thousand years to crack. I usually set mine to 42, the meaning of life, the universe, and everything. But some services will actually cap it so that it's, it has to be a minimum of 8, but can be no more than 24 or 30. I'm not sure why they do that. It's never been logical to me. All right. Now, as you're putting these in, are there any folks that are seeing things that they didn't know had been breached? Or maybe you saw the breach notice and you ignored it. Is there anything in there that surprises you or causes you concern right now? Oh, Amy, that's a really good point. Amy brings up a point. I've had trouble getting providers to delete my accounts when I tried to. That should hopefully become easier. If they do any business at all in California, they're subject to CCPA, the California Consumer Protection Act, and they are supposed to have a way for people to actually report and delete their information. They're supposed to have a process for that. So if you're a California resident and you're having trouble getting somebody to delete your account, absolutely report that to the Attorney General. If they do business in California, and anything online has potential to do business in California, you can push back on them. Send them the link to the CCPA and say you should be able to TTPA. I think is the specific section that addresses deleting accounts. Send them a link to it, and I'll pull up a link for you at some point and see if I can share it after this.
Yeah.
But
yeah, Carlota, Emily's mentioned it in the chat, but yes, if you're a European citizen, the General Data Protection Rule, which does allow you to make people take your information down. I had a student who was doing a co-op at a company, US-based company, and they did have to go through a whole process of removing the individual's information when they requested it. So it'll be interesting to see where this takes us.
Well, and I think that there's a really interesting, simple way of distinguishing the importance of GDPR and what GDPR focuses on versus what we tend to focus on in the US. GDPR focuses on the rights of the individual, and we have failed to do that in the US. GDPR says that if you are a citizen of a European country, of the European Union, anywhere in the world, we will make sure those vendors are protecting your rights as an individual. And in the US, we tend to have a lot of exceptions. Oh, if you do less than 55 million a year, if you don't call yourself a data broker, if you don't, so we have a lot of loopholes, and it leaves the individual extremely vulnerable to those less scrupulous businesses that are selling data. Yeah, we don't have a good unified approach in the US. So that is a failing on our part, frankly. All right. I'm just scanning chat to see if there's anything else. An old email address that is no longer active shows as breached. Should I contact my former employer? If you have a good relationship with them, absolutely. If they're a big company and they haven't figured this out, that's kind of on them. If there's something smaller, reach out to them and just say, hey, I noticed this over here, send them a screenshot. And then you've at least done your Good Samaritan piece.
And if you've reused that password, please change it.
Yes, exactly. All right. And the last little interactive piece or poll we're going to have here. What do you do when you get an email with a suspicious link? Do you ignore it? If you get it to your work email, are you sending it to IT or security and then basically ignoring it? Or do you just consider all emails suspicious? And I'm a little tongue in cheek on this one because this is a harder piece to deal with. And I focus on email in this poll question, but you're also seeing in the last few years, we know that email is called phishing, right? We're also seeing smishing, SMS, fake spam, right? Where they're trying to send you links saying, oh, your FedEx delivery or your Amazon delivery is delayed, or your credit card has been put on hold, or the IRS is whatever, right? And they're sending it to your cell phone now, and they're trying to get you to click those links as well. Yeah, Tiana, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. She says they say their answer is different depending on whether it's going to home or work. If your home email address is on Google, Gmail, That tends to be really good at filtering out the spam email, and it also has a really great way of reporting it. So I'm going to give you here a link to a tool, and forward one called Virus Totals URL Checker. So if you get a link from somebody, maybe through social media, and it's somebody you usually would trust, but maybe they send you a link and they don't give you context. And I always text that person back or message that person back and say, I love you, but I don't click on links when I don't know where they're going. Or I'll text them in another medium, right? And say, hey, has your account been breached? Somebody's sending me links from your Facebook or from your Twitter account. You can copy and paste that link into this URL checker, and VirusTotal will run it against a whole bunch of bigger vendors and see if it comes back as malicious or not. If even one vendor comes back as malicious, then I would be very suspicious of that URL. What this link doesn't do is it doesn't tell you if a site is prone to misinformation or outright disinformation. So this is only going to tell you, hey, we've seen malware or some other kind of malicious activity. It's not going to tell you, hey, this site is total bunk, right? So I would say on the disinformation side, and Ben and Theda, feel free to weigh in here. There are a lot of fact checkers like factchecker.org, Snopes, things like that, that you can look for. But some of these sites are just getting better and better at sounding reasonable and looking like very real information sites. Theda, Ben, do you have any sites that you particularly rely on for fact checking?
Not outside the ones that you've just mentioned. Those are probably my go-tos also.
Mm-hmm. And I think
Yeah.
there's counterdisinfo.org. If you Google for disinformation countermeasures, you'll find some good resources. Go ahead, Ben.
Yeah, I don't have necessarily anything specific. It's just pretty much checking anything that looks at least, well, if it's on social media, I'm going to check it anyway, because so much stuff just gets spread over and over and over, and trying to make sure things don't go back to the exact same source. And usually if it sounds ridiculous, it's probably not true, but they still get spread like crazy.
Yeah, they really do. So just looking back in chat here, I see a couple of some really great conversation going on. Jan says, we don't have an in-house IT person, so I generally mark it spam and delete it without opening. And Tracy says, this is a general question, but if you don't have a CISO or a similar position, how do you get your organization to recognize the importance of such a position? That's a really tough question. I actually, if you hit my LinkedIn, I have a link to a talk that I give called Show Me the Money. And that is some resources that I've put together in my GitHub under Creative Commons for people who are IT or are in a very small org and want to start a security program. And it just gives you some a framework for talking to leadership and talking to your finance team about, we need to protect ourselves. And here's why I'm asking for this spend, or here's why I'm asking for this role. If you're in that position. If you're not in a position where you can really make that ask of your leadership, then it becomes a grassroots thing, right? Going back to that second slide in my intro, you become the one person in the org who's trying to do the right thing. And and when you are very patient with people, and it takes a lot of time sometimes, if you're very patient and explain why you approach things in certain ways, when you give people context, you get better buy-in, is what I found. So Tracy, I don't know if that's helpful, but that maybe Ben and Theda want to weigh in here as well.
If I can add to that, and Tracy, I responded in the chat briefly too. It so depends on the organization and the structure, because if they're the board of trustees, people are becoming much more cybersecurity conscious. But the other thing I'm really seeing drive a lot of change is cyber insurance, because the insurers are rapidly evolving requirements, I think would be one way to say it. But some of the cyber insurers have requirements around, you have to have an ISO or a CISO. The other side, on the research side, is if you are doing any type of government research that has any CMMC requirements in it, they're going to want a responsible party. So I think, as I think you're going to see a lot of external factors external forces driving the creation of that type of office.
And it, again, for those smaller organizations, it may make sense to go for a virtual CISO where, if you can't spend the 150,000, 100,000 a year for a full-time CISO that can help you build your security program, maybe you can afford 60, 80,000 for a virtual CISO to come in and set up your program and coach somebody to run it for the next few years. At Fractional, our model was, we expect you to outgrow us. Like, we expect that within 2 to 3 years of us building your security program and coaching your team, that we should be able to step back and you should be able to run that program without us. And ideally, you hire somebody to be your head of security, but that wasn't always the case. And just from again, outside of academia, from our perspective, most of our clients were coming for sales enablement, but those that weren't coming were coming for a handful of reasons. Either their investors or board of directors said, you will have a CISO and a cybersecurity program, or their cyber insurance got canceled. That was the third largest reason that people would come to a virtual CISO organization was, we're not ready to hire a full-time CISO. We can't get cyber insurance, and our business insurance even is starting to go up without the cyber insurance. So I think Ben's right on the money there that cyber insurance is going to drive a lot of change in the next few years. But you'll also see that cyber insurance is, for $50,000 a year for a $5 million policy, you're also getting some resources as a part of that that's very cost effective. You may get free incident response and forensics resources. You'll definitely get free checks. They'll actually send you someone or set up an appointment with a cybersecurity engineer who will actually help walk you through all of your systems, help you lock things down and configure things. So I think that cyber insurance could be a very powerful tool if you have it.
Yeah, I wanted to say something. Carol, Ido, I'm not sure, has a question in the Q&A. I'm actually trying to I'm trying to talk to some technical folk to get a good answer on whether an IT department can whitelist a machine's MAC address. And of course, the question that's coming back is, why would you want to do that?
Right. So. Right. So I can't seem to find my Q&A at the moment, so I don't have the full question in front of me, but can they do it? Yes. The question I think that's critical is why, right? When we're talking about safe listing or allow listing versus block listing, that just becomes a lot of overhead for an IT team. But if you hear the word zero trust bandied about a lot, and a lot of you who are tech savvy or deeply technical have definitely heard zero trust. And let me explain what that is. I'm going to explain it from an implicit versus explicit trust, and then we'll tie it back to Caroline's question here. Implicit trust is what we've had for the last 20, 30 years, right? You have a login and a password. I implicitly trust that that is Ben logging in. Right? Because that's got Ben's login ID, it's got Ben's password, that's probably Ben. Cool. Well, we found that doesn't work so well because people still IDs and passwords. And so what we're having to move towards is that more explicit trust. Not only do I have Ben's login ID and password, I am coming from Ben's machine, i.e. that is his MAC address. I am on a VPN or an internal network that is trusted. I am on all of these other explicit details that give me a high confidence that this is Ben logging in. So that's really what zero trust is. It's just giving you more markers, more layers that explicitly give more trust that the person who says they're logging in are logging in. Now, the reason that I say this really ties back is that if your organization doesn't have a good understanding of zero trust, they're probably still relying heavily on those allow and block lists, and they're maybe not using them as effectively as they could. Ben, do you want to weigh in here?
Sorry, I was distracted trying to get that answer. So the question, and so Carol, the question I'm having up, coming up is what's the context around your question? And Carlota talking about zero trust is absolutely there because it's these other factors that help ensure that it's you. And I'm sure some of you are traveling, you try to log in. I try to log into my, and I am using LastPass, so that's another discussion based on what I've seen in the chat. But using LastPass when I was traveling in Ireland, I didn't think I was going to be able to get into my password vault at all because I had to have it contacted my work email as opposed to my personal email. And I was eventually able to get through all the checks on doing that. But it is those additional factors that make it clear that this is you, it's coming from this machine. Now, it's not going to be 100%, but it still, is helpful around that.
There's a comment a little further, I think, that tied back to something you had mentioned, Ben, about approaching duo fatigue and just that constant requirement to acknowledge those logins. So that might be part of the challenge here too.
I want to go back to a question that, Ben, you answered, but I know, Theda, you have experience with this at OhioLINK, and it's about the value of tabletop exercises or simulation for testing your disaster response plan, and especially in a cybersecurity context. So, Theda, can you tell us a little about that?
Yeah, so we do tabletop exercises here at OhioLINK at least annually for different services. And typically we'll choose maybe a service that would have the most impact if something would happen, or something that might have a higher risk. So it might be a lower impact, but higher risk. And personally, I found them to be very, very helpful, particularly if you can work with or have the people who are in that response plan that you've created in the room with you or on a WebEx with you, because a lot of what you'll find is, even if you have a plan, as you're walking through the steps in your head, you're making some assumptions about how that communication is going to happen. And when you get to the tabletop, what has happened every time I've participated in one is that, you'll say, all right, I've received this notification. I am now emailing so-and-so in our shared infrastructure department, and I'm asking them to do this. And that person will say, but what do you mean by that request? I don't really understand what I need to get back to you with. And you'll be like, okay, I need to revise my request. If this had happened in real time, we would have gone back and forth a little bit to understand what really should have happened here. So that's a pretty narrow example, but I find them to be very, very helpful, and they help you refine just any of those weak points or things that could be a little better.
Another question that comes up a lot in the context of library services is the risks, or how to mitigate the risks of using open source software. So, a lot of library appliances or software have open source code, even if they're coming from a third-party vendor. And there was a recent Lawfare blog about open source security and the assumptions behind it. And I'd like to ask all of you, what are the best practices for ensuring the open source software that you're using is, well protected from both the internal point of view, but also from if you're using it and end users are downloading, any download is a potential risk. How can libraries ensure that they create a safe environment for those pieces of software? So
I want to take a really quick stab at a little piece of this, because it's a hard question, right? Because there aren't, and I mean, you had supplied an article earlier today, Gwen. There aren't necessarily a lot. There may not even be an active developer anymore. And so many products have implemented pieces of open source software that we don't know if the security is really being maintained or not. So I think there are two things from my perspective, and I'll flip it over to Theda and Carlota. You have to have some kind of vulnerability management program in place that is doing some type of scanning so that you have some idea if there are issues that are known issues. The other part that we're seeing now is also coming from the cyber insurance side, where they are asking us to ask our vendors what security controls you have in place, rather than just signing a contract. I mean, we require, EduCause has a tool called the HECVAT, which is essentially a vendor questionnaire. And we use that a lot depending on what type of information that vendor is going to handle. But a lot of what we're seeing again from cyber insurance, which will push this change, is that we need to push our vendors to find out what they're doing. And whichever you two want to pick this up.
I totally agree. I recently filled out a HECVAT for a client. So I think that it is open source components are so incredibly valuable, but it is a real problem, to Ben's point, especially things that aren't maintained anymore. There isn't a developer driving it, or even if there is a developer driving it, it's not usually their day job, and they're not as incentivized to keep it up, right? Because they get to it when they get to it. It's all volunteer. So I think Ben's spot on. You've got to have other ways of confirming that you are keeping an eye. It's fine to have that component. You can add it to a risk register as I understand that this presents additional risk to my organization, but having some mitigating controls become the really critical piece there. I wouldn't say dump them all, but I would say make sure that if they're not being maintained anymore, if your organization is not willing to take on that maintenance, and some organizations are, but if your organization isn't willing to take on that maintenance, and you have to really question whether it belongs in your code anymore.
And bear in mind that mitigating controls aren't necessarily technical controls. They could be process or administrative controls that are there to reduce the risk. Exactly. One example we saw, which may tie back to open source, I don't really know. As several years ago, we were hit with really direct deposit change requests that had come in from people who had not signed up for multi-factor quickly enough, so it came in from the attackers. But our controller's office had process in place where if that kind of request came in, they automatically contacted that individual through another method to ensure that that request had come from them. That's a purely administrative mitigating control, but it does the trick.
Yeah, that's a really great point. I'm going to move on because Emily has asked an interesting question in the Q&A.
Yes, she has.
Any thoughts on how institutions or libraries should be preparing for quantum computing, or is this just going to be a run for the hills kind of situation? Ben, my take on quantum computing, and I'll be frank, one of my best friends in the world works for Microsoft, and she was brought in to do an assessment of readiness for their data centers for quantum computing, and make a 5-year plan, basically, right? So, IBM, Microsoft, the big guys are anticipating quantum computing within the next 20 years, at least. They make a 5-year plan, but I would say 20 to 30 years, right? But I think that becomes a cloud piece, and I think it just increases our reliance on vendors, and then we have to be very very picky about our vendors. I don't think it's going to hit us for many years on a personal or an on-premise for a small organization.
And I say, Emily, the other piece of that is I am really hoping, it's a partnership thing, right? So you're going to be talking to your IT folk, you're going to be talking to your information security folk. They're going to be talking to people outside the institution. There may be, I am sure there will at some point be a quantum computing readiness group for universities where a lot of this will be hashed out eventually. But controls controls typically lag behind a little bit.
Yeah, they always do. Yeah.
Add or really footstep to that point that this is a partnership issue. That a lot of the concerns or a lot of the challenges that are coming up are probably not things that the library is going to be able to solve on their own. Even if you could, you probably wouldn't want to. So, before something happens, as you can see these things coming down the line, it is really important to make sure that you have good communication with the team on your campus who's going to be dealing with these questions, because the sooner you can talk to them, the sooner they're going to understand the library priorities and be able to work with your priorities as they're developing that plan for how to handle open source software or quantum computing, they can treat it as a university response, not the response except the library. So it's the sooner you can start to build those relationships, the better the end result is going to be.
So again, I want to go back to something that Ben, you answered in the Q&A from Amanda about the most helpful ways to get buy-in from staff or patrons, or alternatively, I would add, you said that you weren't really aware of the, what the library was doing, even on your own campus. Can you all address some of the techniques or helpful approaches to opening that conversation?
This is a very tricky question. It's hard to know what works best. So I'm at a consortial office. The shared infrastructure, RIT, is down the hall from me, and I don't really work directly with end users. So a lot of times, if I want to try to work more closely with someone, one of the best ways for me to do it is to just walk down to their office and see if I can have a quick chat with them. That's not going to work in all cases, and it's not the best answer, but maybe it's an answer.
I think it's building the relationships, right? And it's going to vary by institution. I mean, yes, I said I wasn't aware of the issues that the library was facing after I agreed to be on this panel. And at that point, I went and talked to at least one of our library technical experts is on this call, but I went and talked to them to find out what are the key issues they're facing. And by the counterpoint of that is your library, engaging your IT or information security communication staff to say, we have a problem with this. I mean, the Information Security Office published information about predatory publishers because we were contacted by a faculty member who was concerned about a predatory journal or whatever, you want to reference it. And we ended up putting information up there because we realized it was an issue of concern. So much of this is creating the forums that you have this dialogue and the opportunities to share these concerns. And it's a little, I don't know, Theda, whether it's easier or harder now, because now we're so virtually oriented that we have to be very intentional to provide that type of time. And I think that's the difference between being able to just check down the hall with someone. So that's my response on steps towards this.
I would say too that it's when you're trying to build a relationship with another team on campus or in the library, you're not looking at a one-step thing. You're looking at the start of a process. So if you can make that intentional step to talk to another group or team in this kind of form that Ben's described, then that's the beginning. You can always continue to take steps to improve that relationship, and you should.
I've seen some really effective teams that, especially IT teams, I worked with a consortia in the library, museum, and archive space for several different projects. And their IT team very much took the approach of, and to be fair, they were a sub 100 person organization, but their IT team took the approach of, we always want people to feel like they can ask us questions. We cannot let people feel dumb like that. They were just very open. And then when Slack came along, of course, everyone gets into Slack, and they used that as not just a reporting tool, but an education tool. So the IT channel, somebody would take a screenshot of a phishing email and post it in there and say, hey, is this real? And they would give the kudos, right? The hey, you caught it, that is not real. And at the same time, they're rewarding the person who's saying, hey, there's some phishing email going around. They're educating everyone else that this phishing email is going around. And they've made their populace a part of the solution, right? They've really brought them in. And I think that if your IT group isn't doing that, or if you don't have an IT group, then you almost have to become that person, unfortunately. It does need to be a human being, right? Creating that safe space to ask those questions becomes critical to solving them. Because if they don't get asked, they don't get solved.
Anybody else with any questions? And also, I do want to, if you have suggestions for other topics on this cybersecurity issue that would be helpful to you, please put them in the chat. And the next, when we do this next year, we will perhaps respond to those. And we've got about 10 minutes left. Is there anything, are there any other questions that anyone from the audience has? Because I have a whole I have a whole series we can go, and then at 3:25 we're going to launch the last poll for you. So anybody else, or I can just go forward with Theda, this is for you. What can library consortia do to help their members understand and mitigate the risks of cybercrime?
So one role, and I guess I should say all consortia are different. You will never find two that operate in exactly the same way. For OhioLINK, because one of the services or one of the things that we do for members is to help with some of the reporting of things between the libraries and vendors, and with some of the authentication issues that might happen, we run our own easy proxy instance. There can be a role for consortia to be a participant in that workflow that the library is developing and how they'll respond to a different type of event. We can serve as one of the people that they're able, or one of the groups that they're able to rely on and work with, and to help them maybe even provide some ideas or templates for what those responses might look like.
So
Okay.
Here's another one that was submitted earlier. What would you say is the greatest blind spot for libraries when it comes to cybercrime? And I would expand that to institutions that you've worked with.
I'm going to jump in. Yeah. Like I said, I did work with the consortia around museums, libraries, and archives, and content management systems, that sort of thing. And my biggest fear for them was disinformation. They just didn't have good visibility into, let's be realistic. China as a nation, if they wanted to wipe out as many references to the Uyghurs as possible, they absolutely will hack your system and delete that information. Do you have a good way of seeing that that's happened, other than somebody going, hey, your Uyghurs article is suddenly not on your Wikipedia page anymore? Like that's the kind of scale. I mean, that's an extreme example, to be fair, but I think that the disinformation from anti-democratic countries is my biggest fear for libraries, because you are the source of trust. You are the source of trusted information. And I do have, that does cause me concern.
I just want to reference that previous SNSI webinar, the one called Gone Fishing, does have an example ripped from the headlines of someone at Columbia University Libraries dealing with someone posing as a patron and trying to change information in a library hosted database. So, and yes, it was military, it was military related. So yes, the assumption was this was an agent of a foreign government.
Yeah, and Tiana and Ben has just answered this. She's saying, I'm not sure what steps to take to secure my phone. I'm not sure if it's mentioned in what Ben is linked. It probably is. There's something called Prey Project, Prey. I'm going to type it into chat. this is what I have on all of my devices to keep an eye if they're lost. I can remotely wipe them no matter what the operating system is. I can track them if I need to, that sort of thing. That's what I do to protect my phones. One of the many things, and I'm sure that what Ben has linked has got some really great information in there. And
so
then,
now we're going to launch the last poll, and we're very interested in your responses to this. And again, we have a few more minutes to, if anyone has something that they want to discuss in the chat. And I just want to say thank you. It's very librarianly. Thank you for using the chat to educate each other about some of the things you do, or some of the resources that you use, or some of the concerns that you have. So thank you again. Once again, librarians are very good at sharing information for the benefit of the group. So here's our post-presentation question. And we hope that this webinar has been useful to you in giving you a few more tools and a little more confidence in addressing this for your institution. So any last words? I'm going to ask each panelist to say, if you, I have a feeling I know what Ben's is going to be. What is your one burning piece of advice for the audience? Ben, what is it?
My gosh. The biggest issue is still social engineering. And I despise saying people are the weakest link. I think people are more complicated to help them be secure and to build those good habits in them. And I also don't like trust but verify, but what we're seeing, effective attacks usually start with that innocuous email, "Are you available?" And it's, they think it's from an internal account, it's from an external account, and that starts the conversation. And sometimes that just leads to purchases of gift cards, which if we ever stamp that out, we'll be doing amazingly well. But I mean, that's a piece of it, but I think a lot of it is, it's really secure your people. And that is, frankly, it's what my mission has been for a really long time at this point in time. But I still think it's also the most interesting group to work with, rather than, I don't consider myself to be a technologist. I don't believe they're going to be technical solutions that are going to solve things for us.
I thought it was,
I agree.
Don't reuse your password. I thought that was going to be
that's the easier piece of that. It's so much more complicated.
Yeah.
Carlota.
Oh gosh. This is from my perspective, just everything that we've talked about today, it has just reinforced how universal the cybersecurity issues facing my small clients, very large companies, your organizations. They're all the same problem. We just don't have the money that large scale enterprises do to solve those problems, right? A large scale enterprise can put together a 100-person team and throw a couple $2 billion at something, and we can't do that. But I think it's critical that we have these conversations. So this whole thing overall has just been a wonderful experience for me, as well as it sounds like beneficial for you all.
And Theda, yes, because I'm seeing that 70% of the attendees are more confident about their ability to protect themselves personally from cybersecurity threats. So good job, you guys. So Theda.
Probably the last thing I'd like to say is that any improvements that you can make to improve the security at your work, in your own personal accounts, it's a process. So don't be discouraged if it seems like there's too much for you to do right now. There's always going to be more you can do. Just making those incremental improvements as you learn more, do more. And that will keep you moving in the right direction. And that's maybe more, that's important. Don't let the amount of things you can do stop you in your tracks.
Okay, I'd like to thank my distinguished panelists and the attendees, and as always, ACRL Choice for always being a great host and making it very easy to just concentrate on the content. So thank you all.
Thanks, Gwen. I'll just close us out here. So thank you so much to our presenters today for taking the time to speak with us. And thank you to our attendees for your engagement with your questions and your comments. I'd like to remind our viewers that we did record today's program, so be on the lookout for a follow-up email from Choice and ACRL with a link to the recording. Also, if you have a few minutes after the presentation to fill out a brief survey, we would really appreciate it. So thanks again to all of you out there for joining us. I seems like from the poll you did learn something new from the session, and we're really glad about that. And we hope to see you again in the near future on another webinar.